The road was eerily quiet, illuminated only by the dim glow of streetlights and the pale light of a waxing moon. Captain Malcolm Reed, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, drove his old sedan with practiced ease. He had just left his mother's house, a modest brick home in a neighborhood filled with history and heart, where she still waved goodbye from her porch, no matter how late the hour. The shouldered man in his late 40s drove his old sedan with practiced ease. He had just left his mother's house, a modest brick home in a neighborhood filled with history and heart, where she still waved goodbye from her porch no matter how late the hour. Dressed in a simple polo shirt and jeans, Malcolm was the picture of a regular man unwinding after a long day. His uniform and badge, symbols of his authority, were neatly tucked away in the trunk. This was his time to relax, to shed the weight of his new role as captain of a precinct in dire need of reform. But as he cruised along the empty road, the sudden flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror pulled him from his thoughts. Malcolm pulled over, his heartbeat steady, but his mind sharp. He adjusted his rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of two officers stepping out of their cruiser, Derek Haynes and Kyle Price. Both were mid-30s, with Haynes leading the charge, his broad frame exuding an air of arrogance. Price, leaner and visibly less confident, followed closely behind. Malcolm rolled down his window as Haynes approached, his flashlight aimed directly at Malcolm's face. "License and registration," Haynes barked, his tone clipped and commanding. Malcolm nodded, maintaining his composure. "Of course, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "You were swerving," Haynes replied, his lips curling into a smirk. Malcolm's brows furrowed slightly. The road had been empty, and his driving had been steady. He handed over his documents without a word, though his mind was already analyzing the situation. Haynes took the documents, but instead of walking back to the cruiser, he leaned into the window, his flashlight moving to scan the interior of Malcolm's car. "What's in the bag on the passenger seat?" Malcolm glanced at the bag, a reusable grocery tote filled with leftovers his mother had insisted he take home. "Just food from my mother's house," he said calmly. "Step out of the car," Haynes ordered abruptly. Price shifted uncomfortably behind him, but said nothing. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Officer, I've complied with your requests. Is there a specific reason you need me to step out of the car?" "Are you resisting?" Haynes shot back, his voice rising. Malcolm sighed and unbuckled his seatbelt, stepping out with deliberate movements. The cool night air bit at his skin as Haynes and Price flanked him. "Hands on the hood," Haynes commanded. Malcolm complied, placing his hands on the hood of his car. Haynes patted him down aggressively, his flashlight clattering against Malcolm's keys as he searched his pockets. "Clear," Haynes muttered before signaling Price to search the vehicle. Price hesitated. "Derek, we don't have probable cause." "Just do it," Haynes snapped. Price reluctantly opened the car door, rummaging through Malcolm's belongings while Haynes hovered, smirking at Malcolm. "What's a guy like you doing out here this late anyway?" Haynes asked, his tone dripping with insinuation. "I was visiting my mother," Malcolm replied evenly, his voice betraying no hint of the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You sure about that?" Haynes chuckled. "You look like you've got something to hide." The search yielded nothing, and Price stepped back from the car, visibly uncomfortable. "It's clean," he said quietly. Haynes, clearly dissatisfied, took a step closer to Malcolm. "Next time, keep your car in line. We're watching." Malcolm met Haynes's gaze, his eyes calm but unflinching. For a brief moment, Haynes faltered, as if sensing something he couldn't quite place. "Am I free to go?" Malcolm asked, his tone steady. Haynes hesitated, then waved him off with a dismissive grunt. Malcolm climbed back into his car, his movements deliberate. He adjusted his mirror once more, watching the officers return to their cruiser, their postures tense despite their bravado. As he drove away, his hands gripped the wheel tightly. His mind raced with the implications of the encounter, the blatant abuse of power, and the quiet fear he had seen in Price's eyes. They had no idea who he was. The next day, they would. The precinct was unusually lively that morning. Officers gathered in small clusters, murmuring about the arrival of their new captain. "Malcolm Reed," they repeated, the name carrying a reputation that preceded him. Known for his unflinching integrity and transformative leadership, Malcolm had a track record of cleaning up troubled precincts, rooting out corruption, and rebuilding community trust. "Think he's as tough as they say?" one officer asked, leaning against a desk. "Guess we'll find out soon enough," another replied with a shrug, though a hint of apprehension colored their tone. In the corner of the room, Derek Haynes and Kyle Price stood in tense silence. The events of the previous night hung over them like a dark cloud. Neither had said much to each other, but the unspoken fear was clear in their stiff postures and darting glances. The chatter died down as the sound of polished boots echoed through the corridor. Malcolm Reed entered the precinct, clad in his crisp, tailored captain's uniform. His gold badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the rows of commendations on his chest hinted at his storied career. Every eye in the room turned toward him. His imposing frame and calm but commanding demeanor filled the space with an air of authority. Malcolm's sharp gaze scanned the room, briefly pausing on each group before landing on Haynes and Price. The color drained from Haynes's face, and his usual cocky smirk faltered. Price shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing nervously against his utility belt. They exchanged a glance, silently confirming what they both feared. The man they had harassed last night was now their superior. Malcolm strode to the front of the room, his steps deliberate and steady. The precinct's captain's podium awaited him, and as he took his place, the room fell into complete silence. "Good morning," Malcolm began, his deep voice resonating with a calm yet commanding authority. "I'm Captain Malcolm Reed. Some of you may know of me, and for those who don't, let me be clear about one thing. I'm here to uphold the principles of integrity, accountability, and justice." His words carried weight, each one delivered with precision. Malcolm's gaze swept across the room, but when his eyes locked onto Haynes and Price, his tone shifted subtly, firmer, sharper. "This precinct has a responsibility to serve and protect every member of this community, regardless of their background, their appearance, or where they come from," he continued. "That responsibility is not optional. It's a duty, and anyone who fails to meet that standard will answer for it." Haynes's jaw tightened, and Price swallowed hard, their guilt practically visible. As Malcolm concluded his speech, the officers applauded politely, though the atmosphere remained heavy. Haynes and Price tried to blend into the crowd, avoiding eye contact and standing rigidly behind their colleagues. Malcolm's sharp eyes didn't miss a thing. He had already taken note of their body language, the tense shoulders, the fidgeting hands, the stolen glances. To him, it was confirmation of what he had suspected the night before. They recognized him, and they knew they were in trouble. Other officers in the room also began to notice the duo's strange behavior. Whispers circulated, with one officer muttering, "What's their deal?" As the crowd dispersed, Malcolm lingered near the edge of the room, his imposing figure a silent reminder of his presence. Haynes and Price made a beeline for the exit, but Malcolm stepped into their path, blocking their way with a calm but firm demeanor. "Officers Haynes and Price, right?" Malcolm asked, his tone polite but laced with an undercurrent of authority. "Yes, sir," Haynes replied stiffly, his voice strained. "Good. I look forward to seeing your reports later this week," Malcolm said, his gaze piercing as he leaned in slightly. "I expect nothing but accuracy and transparency." Haynes muttered an affirmative response, while Price avoided eye contact entirely. Malcolm stepped aside, letting them pass, but the unspoken message hung in the air. "I know exactly who you are." As Malcolm walked back to his office, he could feel the weight of his new role settling onto his shoulders. He had seen men like Haynes and Price before, officers who thought their badges were shields for misconduct. But he also knew that this was just the beginning of the change he intended to bring. From his office window, Malcolm watched the precinct below as officers returned to their routines. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He hadn't come this far to back down now. The sound of basketballs bouncing against asphalt filled the air, mixed with the laughter and shouts of children in the background. This was the soundtrack of Malcolm Reed's childhood, a world filled with life and resilience, despite the challenges that surrounded it. Growing up in a small, economically disadvantaged neighborhood, Malcolm learned early on that the odds were often stacked against people like him. As a teenager, Malcolm was no stranger to racial profiling. One particular memory stood out, etched into his mind like a scar. He had been walking home from a late-night basketball practice, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, when flashing blue lights bathed the street. The officers didn't ask where he was headed or why he was out. They only saw his skin and assumed guilt. The humiliation of being frisked against a squad car for no reason other than his appearance left a deep mark. That night, I realized something, Malcolm would later recount. If I wanted to change the system, I couldn't do it from the outside. I had to be on the inside. Malcolm's decision to pursue law enforcement was met with skepticism, even from those closest to him. His mother, a strong-willed woman who had raised him and his siblings alone, worried he would face prejudice from both sides. "They won't accept you," she warned one evening, her voice heavy with concern. "And the community? They'll think you've turned your back on them." But Malcolm was resolute. He saw law enforcement not as the enemy, but as a tool, a flawed one that could be reshaped to serve justice rather than perpetuate injustice. "If I don't try, nothing will ever change," he told her, his eyes filled with quiet determination. The police academy was grueling, not just physically, but emotionally. Malcolm excelled in his training, his natural leadership abilities setting him apart. But he quickly learned that wearing a badge didn't shield him from prejudice. Fellow recruits doubted his capabilities, while veterans dismissed his idealism as naive. Malcolm's first years as an officer were spent walking a fine line between earning the respect of his colleagues and maintaining the trust of the community. His breakthrough came when he began mentoring at-risk youth in the very neighborhood where he grew up. These mentorship programs not only bridged gaps between law enforcement and the community, but also gave Malcolm a sense of purpose beyond his daily duties. His defining moment came during his tenure at his first precinct, where he uncovered a network of corrupt officers running illegal side operations. Despite the risks, Malcolm gathered evidence and worked with internal affairs to expose the corruption, leading to the dismissal of several officers and restoring public trust in the precinct. Through each challenge, Malcolm's philosophy began to take shape. Justice, to him, wasn't about wielding power, but about holding it accountable. He believed that every officer had a responsibility to uphold the law with fairness and integrity, regardless of the pressures or biases they faced. When Malcolm was promoted to captain, it was more than just a professional milestone. It was validation that change was possible. His record of fairness, his ability to foster unity, and his unyielding determination to root out corruption had earned him the respect of both his peers and his community. As Malcolm stood in his office, the weight of his journey felt heavier in the face of the challenges ahead. The precinct he now led was fractured, plagued by officers who viewed accountability as an attack and justice as optional. But Malcolm's past had prepared him for this moment. "Every struggle has shaped me," he thought, gazing at a photograph on his desk, a group of smiling kids from his mentorship program. "And every step has brought me here." Malcolm's commitment to justice without prejudice and accountability without exception wasn't just a professional credo. It was a deeply personal vow, forged through years of hardship and resilience. And it was this vow that would guide him as he faced the battles ahead. The walls of the precinct seemed to close in on officers Derek Haynes and Kyle Price, as whispers of their traffic stop the previous night grew louder. The unease they had felt during Captain Malcolm Reed's introductory speech had only intensified. Every glance in their direction, every passing conversation in the hallway, felt like a silent accusation. In a dimly lit office, Haynes paced back and forth, his face flushed with anger. "We need to get ahead of this," he snapped, slamming a folder onto the desk. Price sat across from him, his posture tense, nervously tapping his pen against a blank report form. "What are we supposed to do, Derek?" Price asked, his voice shaky. "We can't undo last night." "We don't need to undo it," Haynes retorted, his tone dripping with disdain. "We just need to make it look like he was in the wrong." Haynes began dictating their fabricated version of events, claiming Malcolm had been aggressive during the stop and refused to comply with their orders. "Write it down," Haynes barked at Price, who hesitated, his pen hovering over the page. "Derek, this isn't right," Price murmured, his conscience gnawing at him. "Not right," Haynes spat, leaning over the desk. "You think he's gonna let us walk away from this if we don't cover our asses? He's the captain now. If we don't do this, it's our badges, or worse." Reluctantly, Price began to write, though his hand trembled as he did. Meanwhile, Malcolm had already begun piecing together the truth. He spent hours reviewing precinct records, focusing on Haynes and Price's disciplinary histories. Patterns of misconduct emerged, complaints of racial profiling, excessive force and false accusations, many of which had been swept under the rug by their previous captain. Malcolm's suspicions deepened when he discovered discrepancies in their recent reports. It was clear they had been protected by a culture of silence within the precinct. But Malcolm had no intention of letting that continue. A breakthrough came when a civilian witness from the traffic stop, a young delivery driver named Jasmine Torres, came forward. Nervously clutching her phone, she showed Malcolm a video she had captured from across the street. The footage was damning. It showed Haynes escalating the situation without cause, his voice laced with hostility, while Malcolm remained calm and compliant. "I was scared to show this," Jasmine admitted, her voice trembling. "But I saw how they treated you, and it wasn't right." Malcolm thanked her warmly, assuring her that she had done the right thing. Back at the precinct, Haynes grew increasingly paranoid. News of Malcolm's investigation had started to circulate, and he could feel the weight of scrutiny pressing down on him. He pulled Price aside during their shift, dragging him into the locker room where they could speak privately. "We've got a problem," Haynes said, his voice low but urgent. "That witness, Torres, she's got a video." Price's eyes widened. "What kind of video?" "The kind that'll get us both fired if it gets out," Haynes snapped. "We need to handle this." Price's stomach churned. "Handle it how?" Haynes leaned in closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "We pressure her. Make her think twice about showing it to anyone else. And if she doesn't back off, we'll find another way." Price recoiled slightly, the weight of Haynes's words settling over him like a lead blanket. That night, Price sat alone in his small apartment, staring at his badge on the table. The pride he had once felt when he first became an officer had long since faded, replaced by a gnawing sense of doubt. He replayed the events of the traffic stop in his mind, haunted by the image of Malcolm standing with quiet dignity as Haynes barked orders. Price knew what they had done was wrong, and the idea of threatening an innocent civilian to protect themselves made him sick. But Haynes's words echoed in his mind. "It's our badges, or worse." For the first time in years, Price found himself questioning not just his actions, but the entire system that had allowed officers like Haynes to thrive. The next day, Malcolm received additional reports from Internal Affairs about Haynes's history of suppressing complaints and intimidating witnesses. Combined with Jasmine's video, the evidence against him was mounting. Malcolm also noticed subtle shifts in Price's behavior. The younger officer avoided eye contact during roll call and lingered near Malcolm's office, as if contemplating whether to come forward. Malcolm decided to bide his time, knowing that the weight of guilt might push Price to make the right choice. In a final act of desperation, Haynes tried to intimidate Malcolm directly. Confronting him in the parking lot after hours, Haynes attempted to downplay the incident. "Look, Captain," he said with a forced smile. "Last night was just a misunderstanding. No need to blow it out of proportion." Malcolm met Haynes' gaze with unflinching calm. "I don't tolerate dishonesty in my precinct," he replied evenly. "And I certainly don't tolerate abuse of power." Haynes's smirk faltered as Malcolm walked away, leaving him standing alone in the dim light of the parking lot. Back in the precinct, the walls continued to close in on Haynes and Price. The combination of Malcolm's meticulous investigation, the witness video, and Price's growing moral conflict created an atmosphere of inevitable accountability. As cracks formed in their facade, the audience is left anticipating the moment when Malcolm's pursuit of justice will bring their lies crashing down. The conference room at the precinct was cold and sterile, its walls lined with nondescript decor and a long table stretching down the middle. The atmosphere, however, was anything but sterile. It was tense, almost suffocating, as Malcolm Reed entered the room with a folder tucked under his arm. His footsteps were measured, and his face, though calm, betrayed a storm of purpose beneath the surface. Waiting inside were officers Derek Haynes, Kyle Price, and their immediate supervisor, Lieutenant Paul Hayes. Haynes sat rigid, his jaw clenched, while Price fidgeted nervously, avoiding eye contact. Hayes, a gruff man in his 50s, looked equally uncomfortable, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Gentlemen," Malcolm began, his voice steady and commanding as he closed the door behind him. "We have some matters to discuss." Malcolm took his seat at the head of the table, spreading the contents of his folder across the polished surface. The neatly arranged documents included disciplinary reports, witness statements, and a copy of the precinct's dashcam footage policy. At the center of it all was a phone, loaded with the damning video recorded by Jasmine Torres. "I've been reviewing an incident that occurred 2 nights ago," Malcolm continued, his eyes sweeping the table. "Specifically, a traffic stop conducted by Officers Haynes and Price." Haynes opened his mouth to interject, but Malcolm held up a hand, silencing him. "Before we proceed, let me make one thing clear. This is not a discussion. This is an examination of facts." Malcolm began presenting the evidence with meticulous precision. He started with the officer's report of the stop, which claimed the driver, Malcolm himself, had been aggressive and non-compliant. "Interesting," Malcolm said, his tone even, "because this account doesn't align with witness testimony or video evidence." He tapped the phone, and the room filled with the sound of Jasmine's voice narrating the events. The video played, Haynes barking orders, Malcolm remaining calm, and the officers searching the car without cause. Haynes leaned back in his chair, his face red with anger. "That video doesn't show the whole story," he snapped. "Perhaps," Malcolm replied, folding his hands on the table. "But when combined with your history of similar complaints, a troubling pattern emerges." He slid a document across the table toward Lieutenant Hayes. "Here are records of previous incidents involving Officers Haynes and Price, many of which involve excessive force or racial profiling. Strangely, none of these complaints resulted in formal investigations." Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing the spotlight was beginning to fall on his own negligence. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as Malcolm's calm dismantling of their defense left Haynes floundering. "You've got a problem with me, Captain?" Haynes spat, leaning forward aggressively. "I have a problem with officers who betray the trust of this badge," Malcolm replied, his tone icy. "This isn't about you, Officer Haynes. This is about the integrity of this precinct and the people we serve." Haynes slammed a fist on the table. "You think you're better than us? Coming in here, acting like you're going to change everything? You're just another suit who doesn't know what it's like out there." "And what is it like out there, Haynes?" Malcolm asked, his voice rising slightly. "A place where you can target civilians based on the color of their skin? A place where you fabricate stories to cover your misconduct?" As Haynes raged, Price sat in silence, his head bowed. Malcolm turned his attention to him. "Officer Price," he said, his voice softening slightly. "You've been quiet. Is there something you'd like to add?" Price shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his guilt evident. He opened his mouth but hesitated, glancing at Haynes, whose glare was practically daring him to speak. "You're at a crossroads," Malcolm continued, his gaze unwavering. "You can choose to uphold the truth and take accountability, or you can continue down this path and let someone like Haynes dictate your future." Price's lip quivered, but he said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. Malcolm rose from his seat, towering over the table as he addressed the room. "Law enforcement is a position of trust," he began, his voice steady, but filled with conviction. "We are given power, not to abuse or intimidate, but to protect and serve. When officers misuse that power, it doesn't just harm individuals. It erodes the very foundation of justice." He paused, his piercing gaze locking onto Haynes. "You've tarnished this badge, and you've betrayed the people you swore to protect. That stops now." Turning to Price, Malcolm added, "It's not too late to make things right, but that choice is yours, and it's a choice you'll have to live with." Malcolm's words hung in the air as he reached for his folder and closed it. "Effective immediately, Officers Haynes and Price are suspended pending a formal investigation," he declared. "Lieutenant Hayes, you'll oversee the transition, and I'll expect full cooperation." Haynes shot to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "You can't do this," he yelled. "I already have," Malcolm replied coolly. Price remained seated, his head in his hands, while Hayes nodded reluctantly. "Understood, Captain," the lieutenant said, his tone resigned. As Malcolm left the room, he paused at the door, turning back to face them. "This isn't about punishing bad officers," he said. "It's about ensuring that good officers can do their jobs without being overshadowed by misconduct. And it's about restoring trust, something this precinct desperately needs." Malcolm walking down the hallway, his shoulders squared and his steps purposeful. Behind him, the fractured group he left in the conference room represents a system beginning to crack under the weight of accountability. The precinct buzzed with tension as the internal investigation, led by Captain Malcolm Reed, gained momentum. The scope of the inquiry had widened far beyond Haynes and Price. Evidence began surfacing of systemic issues, falsified reports, excessive force incidents, and the silent complicity of higher-ranking officers. Malcolm meticulously reviewed every detail, his unwavering determination to root out corruption setting the tone for the investigation. As the findings mounted, Malcolm's measured yet firm approach made it clear that no one was above accountability. Kyle Price sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of his guilt crushing him. He stared at his badge on the table, its once pristine sheen now a reminder of his complicity. Malcolm's words echoed in his mind. "It's not too late to make things right." Unable to carry the burden any longer, Price requested a private meeting with Malcolm. His hands trembled as he handed over a file containing emails, altered reports, and internal messages proving Haynes's long history of misconduct. "I should have done this sooner," Price admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm nodded, his expression a mixture of understanding and firmness. "It takes courage to step forward," he said. "But this is only the beginning. If you're ready to be part of the solution, now's your chance." Price's cooperation became a turning point, not just for the case but for his own character. By exposing the depths of Haynes's corruption, Price began to reclaim his integrity. The evidence Price provided accelerated the investigation, painting a damning picture of Haynes's misconduct. Combined with civilian testimonies and records of racial profiling, the case against Haynes was airtight. The media caught wind of the scandal, amplifying the public's outrage. News outlets ran headlines like, "Systemic Racism Exposed in Local Precinct. Captain Reed Spearheads Reform." Protests erupted outside the station, with community members demanding accountability and justice. Haynes, backed into a corner, lashed out publicly, attempting to paint himself as a scapegoat. But Malcolm, armed with incontrovertible evidence, dismantled his narrative with composure. As the precinct's internal affairs department finalized its findings, the results were clear. Haynes and Price were terminated from the force, and Haynes faced criminal charges for falsifying reports and abusing his authority. Price's decision to come forward marked the beginning of his redemption. Though he was no longer an officer, he began volunteering in community outreach programs, working to rebuild trust in law enforcement. Malcolm saw potential in Price's transformation. During a quiet conversation, he encouraged Price to continue on this path. "It's not about where you've been," Malcolm said, "but where you're going. If you use this second chance wisely, you can make a real difference." Price's actions served as a reminder that even in a flawed system, individuals could choose to change for the better. With the investigation concluded, Malcolm turned his attention to systemic reform. He worked closely with community leaders and external advisors to implement new policies, including mandatory ethics training. All officers were required to attend sessions focusing on racial bias, ethical policing, and de-escalation techniques. Anonymous reporting systems. To protect whistleblowers and encourage accountability, Malcolm introduced secure channels for officers and civilians to report misconduct. Community engagement programs. Officers began participating in outreach initiatives, fostering trust and communication between the precinct and the people they served. These reforms were not just symbolic. They represented tangible steps toward rebuilding a fractured system. The changes Malcolm introduced began to take root. Officers who once viewed accountability as a threat started recognizing it as an opportunity to improve their practices. Community members, though initially skeptical, noticed the difference in how the precinct operated. At a town hall meeting held in the precinct's gymnasium, Malcolm addressed the community directly. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice steady but passionate. "Trust isn't rebuilt overnight, but with every action we take, we move closer to justice, fairness, and equality." The crowd erupted in applause, a moment of unity that symbolized the progress being made. As Malcolm walked through the precinct's halls the next day, he noticed small but meaningful changes. Officers engaged more respectfully with each other and the public. Civilian complaints decreased, and trust between the precinct and the community began to grow. Malcolm paused by a bulletin board showcasing photos from community events. Images of officers playing basketball with local kids, hosting safety workshops, and mentoring at-risk youth. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil that had defined the precinct months earlier. This wasn't the end of the journey, Malcolm knew, but it was a crucial step in the right direction. Justice had been served, and the precinct was on a path to redemption. Malcolm's leadership proved that change was possible, even in the face of deep-seated corruption. The audience is left with the knowledge that while systemic reform is challenging, it starts with individuals willing to hold the line and fight for what's right. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet road where it all began. Captain Malcolm Reed stood by the shoulder, his hands in his pockets, his gaze distant as he took in the stretch of asphalt. This was where the hostile traffic stop had occurred, the moment that sparked a transformation, not just for him, but for the entire precinct. Malcolm reflected on how far things had come. The struggle for justice and accountability had been arduous, filled with moments of doubt and resistance, but progress had been made. He could see it in the precinct's changing culture, in the cautious smiles of civilians who were beginning to trust again, and in the efforts of officers who now walked the path of integrity. The precinct itself had become a symbol of change. Walls once adorned with impersonal posters now showcased photographs of community events. Officers reading to children, participating in neighborhood cleanups, and engaging with local leaders. The shifts were subtle but significant. Conversations among officers had become more respectful, and Malcolm noticed a genuine effort to uphold the values he had instilled. "Morning, Captain," an officer greeted him warmly as he entered the building. Malcolm nodded, acknowledging the sense of camaraderie that had begun to take root. Even the once divided community was beginning to heal. Complaints against the police had decreased, and public gatherings now felt less like tense standoffs and more like opportunities for collaboration. That evening, the community hosted a special event in Malcolm's honor. The recreation center buzzed with life, filled with laughter and conversations that bridged the gap between civilians and law enforcement. Malcolm stood at the edge of the crowd, watching officers interact with families and kids. He spotted Kyle Price, no longer in uniform, but helping organize activities for local teens, his face a mix of humility and quiet determination. Price's journey of redemption had become a powerful example of the precinct's evolving values. As the crowd quieted, Malcolm stepped onto the small stage. Applause greeted him, and he raised a hand to acknowledge the support. His voice carried the same calm authority that had guided the precinct through its toughest moments. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," Malcolm began. "This community is more than just a collection of streets and houses. It's a family. And like any family, we've had our struggles, our disagreements, and our moments of pain. But what defines us isn't the challenges we face. It's how we rise to meet them." He paused, scanning the room filled with faces of all ages, colors, and walks of life. "This precinct has made mistakes," he continued, his tone firm but sincere. "We've let you down, but I promise you those days are over. Together we're building something better, a precinct that serves with honor, officers who protect with compassion, and a community that stands united, even when the odds seem insurmountable." Malcolm turned his attention to a group of young recruits sitting near the front. "To those of you just starting your journey in law enforcement, remember this. Our power comes from the trust the community places in us. It's a privilege, not a right, and it's our duty to earn that trust every single day." His words resonated deeply, drawing a standing ovation from the audience. The next morning, Malcolm walked the halls of the precinct with a renewed sense of purpose. The once tense atmosphere had transformed into one of quiet determination and mutual respect. Officers nodded as he passed, their acknowledgement no longer forced but genuine. Stopping by the precinct's new community board, Malcolm smiled at a photo of himself surrounded by kids from a local mentorship program. The future wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. It was about laying a foundation for the next generation to thrive. As Malcolm exited the precinct, the camera followed his steady stride, a visual representation of strength and resilience. His voiceover echoed in the background. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's hard, it's uncomfortable, and it takes courage. But it starts with those willing to lead by example. And when we stand together, the impossible becomes possible.